Welcome to R&R Live and Life. What an absolutely stunning way to say goodbye to Wilsons Promontory, though the morning did become quite foggy as we made our way towards Fish Creek, a small dairy farming community. We had taken the Me and Yan Promontory Road to the South Gippsland Highway that would take us into Leongatha and on to Korcumburra. Our journey today took us through lush farmland, grazing and cropping country, past wind farms, state forests and a native flower farm. As always, the countryside was ever changing, and we could not get over how green it was. Victoria certainly has a very different climate than in central and northern Queensland. We were fortunate enough to have beautiful weather, even with a few odd days where there were showers. But rain is always welcome, especially to those who live on the land. We had made our way back through Yankee towards Fish Creek. Rick and I had been interested in the Yankee Drain, which was built to drain water from the large swamp prior to settlement and runs from near the national park boundary to empty into shallow inlet. Having lived on the land for many years, we are always interested in not only the dairy farms, but also the cattle and sheep farms, tiny and more intensive than the huge stations we were used to living on. Not long after our travels had started for the day, fog rolled in, shrouding the country in a fine mist, making it difficult to see past the edges of the road, but did give us another perspective of the environment. Being a wetter climate than what we were used to, it was interesting to see the tree ferns that lined the edge of the road. We did not stop in Fish Creek as it was still early. Set in idyllic lush countryside, this small town was dotted with cafes and galleries. Fish Creek was first settled in 1886 when land was selected and cleared in the dense forest region. Soon after, dairy cattle began grazing. Not far out of town, we passed Flyers Creek Wind Farm, consisting of 38 turbines, a great source of clean, sustainable and renewable energy. It was then on to Median, snuggled in the middle of the picturesque Strzelecki Ranges, where we stopped to stretch our legs with a walk around the showgrounds and to check out the few camping spots there. We were finding that there were more and more permanent residents now occupying these campgrounds. Meanyan was originally established as a train station on the South Gippsland Railway line in the late 1800s. The station operated for just over a century and has now been transformed into the spectacular Great Southern Rail Trail that winds 131 kilometres through the Gippsland area. What a great way to use the rail line that is no longer in use. From Meanyan we continued on through Leongatha, not stopping as we planned to come back and check it out in a day or two, so kept going to Korcumburra, where we made camp at the showgrounds around late morning. I promptly caught up on some washing while making an early lunch. After lunch we commenced one of the circuits that Rick had planned for this area and made our way to Lock along the South Gippsland Highway. This historic town lies amongst lush rolling hills of the Strzelecki Ranges and the farmland with deep soil and said to have plentiful rainfall, though we could not see any evidence of this, with the area looking more like near drought conditions. Land selections began in the area in the early 1880s. Just off the South Gippsland Highway, Lock had many 20th century buildings, making for a stunning streetscape. We had a quick look at the Lock suspension bridge that spans Alsop Creek, but did not stay long. We turned off the South Gippsland Highway to follow the Nyora St Helier Road through rolling hills, very dry-looking country, with views towards Port Phillip Bay on occasions. There was a huge difference between the houses from massive new buildings compared to the older farmhouses we passed. The area was primarily agriculture, with farms and open landscapes dominating the scenery, with horse studs or spell paddocks. We followed Stewart's Road for a while before continuing along the shut-off, stopping on the side of the road at the shut-off lookout that could only be described as a pullover, with views across the bay in one direction and the rolling hills in the other, before joining the Grantville-Glenalvie Road that would take us into Grantville and the Bass Highway. The Bass Highway turned into the Phillip Island Link Road that took us through San Remo on the western tip of Anderson Peninsula and across the huge 640-metre bridge that links mainland Victoria to Phillip Island. San Remo was originally established as a deep water port for the transportation of farm produce and coal to Melbourne in the mid-1800s. A thriving fishing industry soon developed and is currently the base for Australia's larger shark fishing fleet. The sea views along this stretch of the road as we drove through San Remo were quite spectacular. From San Remo we made our way to Sunderland Bay and onto Back Beach Road past Phillip Island's motor circuit before continuing along the Pyramid Road to the Lookout, one of the most fascinating natural attractions on Phillip Island. The rock's magnificent distinct silhouette stands out against the azure waters of Bass Strait. At the base of the pyramid are pink rocks due to the presence of granite, while on top it is made of composed basalt. We wandered along the Broadwalk looking for shearwater nests, as well as out over the sea for penguins. I did not see any penguins, but did see shearwater nests. I spent time watching the waves as they rolled in against the backdrop of ancient pink granite. It really was an amazing scene. On our return along Back Beach Road, we slowed so that I could enjoy the flocks of Cape Barren geese grazing in the paddocks opposite the motor circuit. These large pale grey with a slight brown tint birds are capable of drinking salty and brackish water, which allows them to remain on offshore islands year-round. So I was surprised by the numbers we were seeing, but then again they have adapted to feeding on agricultural land, and it was not their breeding season. They really are a very distinctive bird. Phillip Island, 26 kilometres long and 9 kilometres wide, forms the natural breakwater for the shallow waters of the Western Port, a large tidal bay opening into Bass Strait. The island, with an area of around 101 square kilometres and 97 kilometres of coastline, has been recognised by UNESCO as part of the Mornington Peninsula and Western Port Biosphere Reserve, highlighting the area's exceptional natural significance. The southern and western coasts of the island support a significant population of little penguins, short-tailed shearwaters and Pacific gulls. A string of bad events has jeopardised the existence of the penguins. A heat wave in 2019 saw many penguins die. Grass fires, due largely to poor practices in settlement, and climate change threaten the penguins' habitat, as well as invasive foxes that thankfully have been eradicated. But this has led to a rise in the invasive rabbit population, exacerbating erosion and threatening native orchid species on the island. Phillip Island sure has had its struggles. With mild, wetter winters and relatively dry summers, the prevailing southwesterly winds from Bass Strait buffet the island. The captivating coastline, with its dramatic cliffs and sheltered bays, was well worth visiting. On leaving Phillip Island, we made our way through Anderson and continued along the Bass Highway to Dalston and Wonthaggi. From there we began making our way back to Korcumburra, first along Linz Road and then on to Ivanloch and to Leongatha and Korcumburra, completing another circuit of country. Early settlers sure had their work cut out clearing the hills in the area. It was noticeably different country we were travelling through, but so very dry, with very little feed. We had never been to Victoria, and seeing the difference in climate patterns to northern Australia made it very interesting, especially seeing how very dry the country was. Seeing drought conditions in this part of Australia is very different to northern Australia, and think maybe the intensive practices make it more pronounced. Even the cattle were showing signs of drought conditions, as did the parched and sometimes barren vineyards, some with shrivelled or what looked like dead vines. The following morning we moved Gidget to a powered site and were thankful that we had, as that afternoon cars poured into the grounds to watch the weekend games of netball and football that were taking place. A great way to spend our rest day. During games, Rick and I took the time to stroll uptown to see what Korcumburra had to offer. The bakery is always a great place to stop, and we invested in a fresh loaf of sourdough, while Kelly's cafe was closed for the day. Our next circuit awaited, so the following morning, though overcast, we made our way through picturesque landscapes surrounded by rolling hills, farmland, and natural bushland to Strzelecki, in the proximity of the Strzelecki Ranges and the Tarabulga National Park. Strzelecki was named after the Polish explorer and scientist Paul Strzelecki, who travelled through Gippsland from the Upper Murray area to Western Port Bay in 1840. Most of the village's buildings have fallen down or been removed, with the remaining buildings the Mechanics' Institute Hall, built in 1905, and a uniting church. Grazing and dairying are the prominent industries in the area. The Strzelecki Ranges that surround the village are so extensive they overlap 5 local government areas and generally run east-west and extend for roughly 100 kilometres. They are composed of deeply distinct layers of sandstone and mudstone, rising from 300 to 500 metres, with the highest point at Mount Tassie being 740 metres. The western ranges have been successfully cleared for agriculture and feature green rolling hills with small farms and settlements in the south. The eastern Strzelecki remains heavily forested, with steep ridges and valleys. We made our way down Ross and Witherden's Road to Strzelecki Lookout, but were disappointed as the lookout was obscured by trees planted by the Landcare Group. But the drive along the narrow road was stunning. Thankfully, we did not meet anyone on the road, as there was no room for a second vehicle to pass. Once back in Strzelecki, we continued along the Korcumburra-Warragul Road through more rolling hills with steep valleys and seemed to be following along the top of ridges. On arriving in Warragul, we drove down Queen Street and took in the 19th century architecture of the ornate frontages and archways of the local banks, shops and hotels, and the heritage-listed Warragul Station and Shire Hall built in 1893. It was hard for me to believe that we were only about 100 kilometres from Melbourne until we had reached a huge roundabout with one arm pointing to Melbourne. Set amongst rolling green hills between the Strzelecki Ranges to the south and Mount Baw Baw Plateau of the Great Dividing Range to the north, Warragul is at the heart of a rich dairy farming area that supplies both Melbourne and the substantial sections of the country with fresh milk. With so much lush pasture around, I could see why this area could support so many different farms, including beef cattle, mixed farming, along with other niche farms including apples, potatoes, flowers, poultry and eggs, as well as producing gourmet foods. After checking out Warragul, we made our way to Nareem South, located on the doorstep of Baw Baw National Park. We stopped to check out the Tarago Reservoir that supplies towns on the Morning Peninsula and around the Western Port area. The dam is constructed from rock fill with a clay core. It was completed in 1969 and then enlarged in 1971. We enjoyed the amazing views, but the weather was closing in and we had to dodge the showers. From there we passed through Nareem and Nareem Junction, through more rolling hills, lush green pastures, forests and national parks. Even though there had been showers, it was still an amazing trip, seeing trees dripping, fog rising in valleys, and everywhere we looked so clean and refreshed. Our next point of interest was at the historic Trestle Bridge just before Noji. We took a short drive along a gravel road off Mount Baw Tourist Drive to the Noji Trestle Bridge, surrounded by a tall mountain ash forest, scenic eucalypt and fern forests. The Truss Bridge is the tallest surviving wooden truss bridge in Victoria at 21 metres in height and 102 metres in length, comprising 19 trusses, a remnant of the old railway line that once connected Noji to Warragul. We took a short walk up the stairs to experience the spectacular, picturesque views of the beautiful forest from the top of the bridge, and we could look down into the car park at its base. Originally constructed in 1919, but completely burnt down in 1939 and rebuilt in the same year, it certainly was a well-preserved timber rail bridge. Truss bridges have fallen out of favour because they are much more labour-intensive to construct than other types of bridges, and generally are obsolete with modern construction. Also, if one element of the bridge fails, the entire span will fall down. We could well imagine the days of old, with sawmills singing and steam trains struggling to get their loads over huge trestle bridges and up the steep grades along the old railway line that operated between 1919 and 1956. Construction of the bridge was undertaken between 1917 and 1919, and when complete was one of the largest bridges of its type in the Southern Hemisphere. Primarily used to transport timber from the forest surrounding the timber town of Noji to nearby Warragul. However, it did take passengers, goods and livestock to the nearby towns. It really was an amazing piece of infrastructure. It is hard not to compare it to the one we had seen at Stony Creek at Now, though we could experience the height by walking across this one. We had only been able to look up from the base and stand at the edge of Stony Creek Bridge, so found being at tree height added a different dimension to our experience, as was being up in amongst the misty trees. Rick and I will leave you at the Noji Trestle Bridge for this episode, having not completed our circuit. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Give us a thumbs up if you have. Join us next time as we complete our day trip and make our way back towards Korcumburra through Noji and the meandering Latrobe River, past Blue Rock Lake, Tangel South and the picturesque Maui, Morwell and Leongatha, and finally to Korcumburra to complete our circuit. Stay safe and enjoy life. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R, living life.